You seriously think you can bring this beast online, old-timer? We've got a whole team of nuclear engineers who can't. The voice, belonging to a young corporal named Evans, dripped with the kind of arrogant condescension that only youth can perfect. He stood with his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips as he looked down at the old man before him. Richard Morrow, 85 years old and clad in a simple visitor's jacket, offered no reply. His gaze was fixed on the silent, monstrous machinery of the aircraft carrier's engine room. He ran a hand along a cold steel railing, his touch gentle, familiar. Around them, a group of junior sailors and Marines exchanged amused glances, their quiet snickering echoing in the vast, still chamber. The great heart of the warship was dead, and this old man was supposed to be the solution. It was, to them, utterly laughable. The silence from the command deck was more damning than any alarm. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the pinnacle of naval engineering, and the pride of the fleet, was adrift. A catastrophic power failure during a critical pre-deployment exercise had plunged the supercarrier into darkness and silence. Every digital fix, every modern protocol had failed. The reactors were stable but cold, and the complex web of redundant systems designed to reboot them had failed in a cascading disaster no one had predicted. The ship and the careers of every officer on board were dead in the water. Desperation had led Captain Riggs, the ship's commander, to this last improbable resort. An old civilian, a guest on a legacy tour with his grandson, was rumored to have served on the original nuclear carrier, the USS Enterprise, CVN-65. The grandson, a fresh-faced ensign named Miller, had nervously suggested that his grandfather might know something about the old manual override systems, archaic procedures that were more legend than fact, long since scrubbed from digital manuals and modern training. Now that legend stood before them, a stooped figure in a cavernous, dimly lit engine room, looking less like a savior and more like a man who had wandered away from a tour group. Lieutenant Commander Shaw, the chief engineer, pinched the bridge of his nose, the stress of the last 12 hours etched onto his face. He saw Richard Morrow not as a resource but as a distraction, a folktale wasting precious time. Corporal Evans, however, saw him as a punching bag for his own frustration. "With all due respect, sir," Evans said, loud enough for the whole crew to hear, "this is a fifth-generation A1B reactor, not a steam kettle from the 1960s. What's he going to do? Hit it with a wrench?" More snickers. Morrow seemed not to hear. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his eyes scanning the banks of dead consoles and dormant turbines. The emergency lighting cast long, dancing shadows, making the massive engines look like sleeping steel titans. The air was thick with the scent of cool metal and ozone. Morrow's quiet contemplation was a stark contrast to the frantic energy that had filled the space just an hour before. "I need a schematic," Morrow said, his voice quiet but clear. "A real one. Paper. I need to see the secondary coolant pumps in the emergency induction manifold." Commander Shaw sighed. "Sir, all our schematics are digital, and the system is down." "There's always a paper copy," Morrow stated, not as a question but as a fact. "In a lid-lined locker in the engineering control center. There has to be." Shaw exchanged a look with one of his petty officers, who shrugged. No one had looked for paper schematics in 20 years. While a search was reluctantly ordered, Morrow continued his slow walk, his hand trailing along a thick bundle of insulated cables. He stopped at a section of the steel deck that looked identical to every other section. He tapped it with his foot. "Get me a pry bar." "There's a manual valve panel under here." Evans laughed out loud this time. "A what?" "Sir, this is a solid fusion-welded deck plate. You're not going to find a secret hatch from some old spy movie." Morrow simply looked at him, his gaze steady, until the young corporal's laughter died in his throat. The old man's eyes, clear and blue, held a depth of experience that was unsettling. Ensign Miller, Morrow's grandson, watched from the edge of the room, his face burning with a mixture of pride and humiliation. He saw the genius in his grandfather, but all these experts saw was a senile old man. A sailor eventually returned with a heavy pry bar. To the utter astonishment of the engineering crew, when the bar was wedged into a nearly invisible seam and leveraged, a heavy plate of the deck groaned and lifted. Beneath it, nestled in a recessed compartment, was a series of large, grease-covered manual valves, their red handles coated in decades of dust. They were relics of a forgotten age of engineering. Evans stared, his mouth slightly agape. "No way," he muttered. "They never get rid of the basics," Morrow said softly, more to himself than to the crew. He knelt, his old knees cracking in protest, and studied the arrangement. He asked for a wrench, a pressure gauge, and a hardline telephone, the kind that drew power directly from the line itself. Each request was met with a growing sense of bewilderment. This was not in any manual. This was something else entirely. As Morrow began to work, methodically checking each valve, Evans's disbelief curdled back into suspicion. "Hey guys, get a picture for the museum," he whispered to his friends. World War II vet tries to fix a spaceship. The insult, though whispered, was sharp enough to cut through the tense quiet of the room. From the command deck, Captain Riggs's voice, strained and tinny, crackled over the emergency intercom. "Engineering status report. The fleet admiral is en route for a full systems review. I need something, Shaw. Anything." The mention of the admiral added a new layer of pressure. Time was running out, and as Richard Morrow took a large red-handled valve in his wrinkled, calloused hands, the weight of a moment 60 years prior settled over him. His hands, now spotted with age, became young again, strong and sure. The silent engine room of the Ford dissolved, replaced by the chaotic, screaming heart of the USS Enterprise in 1962. Red lights flashed, painting the cramped space in the colors of alarm. A high-pitched whine drilled into his ears. He was 20 years old, his face streaked with sweat and grease, wrestling with this very same type of valve. Steam, superheated and invisible, hissed from a fractured pipe nearby, and the deck plates vibrated with the fury of a reactor on the verge of catastrophe. A voice, young and terrified, shouted over the din. "It's not enough, Rick. She's gonna go critical." The memory was not a story he told at parties. It was a visceral, terrifying blur of heat, noise, and the absolute certainty of failure. It was the moment he learned the difference between what the manual said was possible and what a man had to do to survive. He blinked, and the ghost of the Enterprise faded. He was back in the cold, quiet engine room of the Gerald R. Ford. His expression was placid, unchanged, but the audience of young, skeptical faces around him could not see the fire that had just been rekindled in his mind. He knew this machine, not because he had studied it, but because he had survived its ancestor. He knew the feel of the valve, the precise amount of pressure it could take before it sheared. His hands remembered. Ensign Miller could not stand it any longer. He had watched the barely concealed mockery from the ship's most elite technicians. He had seen the chief engineer, a man responsible for a billion-dollar vessel, offer his grandfather nothing but weary indulgence. The latest jibe from Corporal Evans, "Careful you don't break a hip, Pops," was the final straw. His grandfather was here to help, to offer a lifetime of experience that couldn't be downloaded to a tablet, and he was being treated like a doddering fool. Miller stepped back into the shadows of a massive conduit, his jaw tight with anger. He pulled out his personal phone. It felt like a betrayal of the chain of command, an act of desperation, but he couldn't let this continue. He had a number, given to him upon his commissioning by his grandfather, with a simple instruction: "Only use this if you're in trouble you can't get out of." He had never imagined this would be the circumstance. His thumbs flew across the screen, dialing the number. It was answered on the second ring by a crisp, professional voice. Admiral Thompson's office. Ensign Miller took a breath, keeping his own voice low but steady. "This is Ensign Miller. I'm on the USS Gerald R. Ford. My grandfather, Richard Morrow, is down in the engine room." He paused, listening to the condescending laughter from across the room. "They have a complete power failure, and they're treating him like a joke. Sir, he's the one they called for help." He delivered the final, crucial piece of information. He served under the Admiral, on the Enterprise. The line went silent for a moment, not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of sudden, focused attention. The name Richard Morrow had landed like a depth charge. "Stay right where you are, Ensign," the aide's voice returned, now sharp with a new urgency. "Do not let your grandfather leave that engine room. The Admiral is already en route to the carrier. I will relay your message to him directly." The call ended. A sense of impending justice settled over Ensign Miller. Above them, on the storm-tossed surface of the ocean, the cavalry had been alerted. While his grandfather continued to work, oblivious to the drama and surrounded by fools, the wheels of a great and terrible reckoning had begun to turn. Inside the vibrating cabin of a Seahawk helicopter, Admiral Thompson, a man whose 68 years were etched into a face that looked like it was carved from granite, stared out at the crippled silhouette of the USS Gerald R. Ford. He was on his way to oversee a disaster, to relieve a captain and gut a command staff. His aide leaned forward, shouting over the roar of the rotors, "Sir, a priority message from an Ensign Miller on the Ford. He says his grandfather is in the engine room, a Mr. Richard Morrow." The aide paused, letting the name hang in the air. "He says they served together, on the Enterprise." The Admiral's stoic mask shattered. A flicker of disbelief crossed his face, followed by a wave of recognition so profound it seemed to take the air from his lungs. "Morrow. Rick Morrow is on the Ford?" His voice, A low, gravelly thing that could make captains tremble was suddenly filled with a raw, forgotten emotion. "Get me Captain Riggs." On the bridge of the Ford, Captain Riggs took the priority call, his stomach clenching. He expected to be fired. The Admiral's voice boomed through the receiver, bypassing all pleasantries. "Captain, I understand you have a civilian in your engine room. A Mr. Richard Morrow." "Yes, Admiral," Riggs confirmed, his own voice sounding weak and thin. "A long shot. The engineering team is skeptical." Skeptical. The word was a thunderclap. The Admiral's tone dropped, becoming as cold and dangerous as the deep ocean beneath them. "Captain, let me be clear. The man you have in your engine room didn't just read the book on nuclear reactor manual, overrides. He wrote it. He wrote it with grease and sweat and guts during the '62 incident when he single-handedly prevented a core meltdown on the Enterprise with nothing but a wrench and a prayer. The man you are allowing your crew to mock is a living legend. You are to afford him every courtesy and any resource he requires. Is that understood?" The line went dead, leaving Captain Riggs in a stunned, horrified silence. The old man wasn't just a veteran. He was a hero. A hero his crew was, at this very moment, treating like an incompetent fool. The dramatic irony was a physical weight, crushing the air from the bridge. The audience above deck now knew the secret, while the antagonists below remained blissfully, dangerously ignorant. Back in the engine room, a low hum suddenly filled the air. A single bank of lights flickered on above a secondary control panel. Richard Morrow had successfully bypassed a series of burnt-out relays, coaxing the first spark of life back into the ship's veins. It was a small, staggering victory. It was also, to Corporal Evans, the last straw. He saw not progress but a dangerous, unsanctioned act. "What did you do?" he shouted, his fear manifesting as aggression. He strode forward, closing the space between them. "You can't just start rerouting power on a whim. You have no idea what you're doing." Even Commander Shaw, the chief engineer, was unnerved. This was chaos. It was outside any procedure, any protocol he had ever learned. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the console," Shaw said, his voice tight. "You're a civilian in a restricted area. This has gone far enough." But Evans pushed it past the point of no return. He reached out and placed a hand firmly on Richard Morrow's shoulder. "That's enough, old man. Let's go. We'll have the Master-at-Arms escort you topside. You're a security risk." The physical contact, the outright threat of arrest, was the ultimate act of arrogant overreach. Richard Morrow did not flinch. He didn't even turn his head. His eyes remained fixed on a pressure gauge that was, for the first time in 12 hours, slowly, steadily beginning to climb. "Son," he said, his voice still quiet but now as heavy as the hull of the ship itself, "take your hand off me." Before Evans could react, the main hatch to the engine room burst open with a deafening clang of steel on steel. The sound echoed through the vast chamber like a gunshot, freezing everyone in place. Captain Riggs stood in the opening, his face as white as a ghost. Flanking him were 2 United States Marines in full-dress uniform, their rifles held at a ceremonial yet intimidating present arms. And striding past them, his presence sucking all the air from the room, was Admiral Thompson. The Admiral's arrival was a seismic event. His eyes, like chips of ice, swept across the scene, taking in the shocked faces of the engineering crew, the hand of Corporal Evans on Morrow's shoulder, and the quiet dignity of the old man at the console. "Admiral on deck," Commander Shaw stammered, his voice cracking as he and Evans snapped to a clumsy, panicked attention. The rest of the crew froze, their mockery turning to ash in their mouths. This wasn't a review. This was an execution. The low, steady hum of the auxiliary power Morrow had just brought online served as the ominous soundtrack to the unfolding drama. Admiral Thompson didn't spare a glance for the trembling chief engineer or the terrified corporal. He strode across the deck, his polished shoes clanging with resolute purpose, and stopped directly in front of Richard Morrow. The hard lines on the Admiral's face softened, replaced by a look of deep, profound respect. He drew himself up to his full, imposing height. Then, in an act that defied all protocol and stunned every person in the room, the 4-star Admiral snapped his hand to his brow in the sharpest, most perfect salute he had ever rendered. He held it, his gaze locked on the old man. "Rick," the Admiral said, his voice booming through the cavernous space, thick with 60 years of unexpressed gratitude. "It is an honor to see you again." Richard Morrow slowly, painfully straightened his back. He wiped a smear of grease from his hand onto his worn trousers. He didn't return the salute with military precision, but with a simple, tired nod of his head, a greeting between equals. "Jimmy," he replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "You've done well for yourself." The Admiral lowered his hand but did not break his reverent gaze. Then he turned, his face, which had been warm with respect, transformed into a mask of cold fury. He turned that fury, like the barrels of a battleship's main guns, upon Commander Shaw and Corporal Evans. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" he bellowed, his voice reverberating off the steel bulkheads. Everyone, including Captain Riggs, flinched. "This is Chief Petty Officer Richard Morrow. In 1962, aboard the USS Enterprise, a primary coolant leak threatened to send the reactor into a full-scale meltdown. Our state-of-the-art systems, the best in the world, failed. The book said the ship was lost. Every officer on that bridge was ready to order abandoned ship." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. "But this man, then a 20-year-old kid with more courage than sense, refused to let our first nuclear carrier die. He climbed into a service tunnel no bigger than a coffin, surrounded by superheated steam that was melting the paint off the walls, and he manually forced a bypass valve open, saving the ship and all 5,000 hands aboard. The emergency procedure he invented on the spot, under unimaginable pressure, is the reason manual overrides exist in the first place. The very concept you've forgotten, he created with his own 2 hands." He jabbed a trembling finger toward the slowly reviving console. "He is the only man on this planet who knows the soul of this machine, because he was there when it was born. He doesn't need your condescension. He doesn't need your permission. He is the reason all of you are lucky enough to serve on a technological marvel like this instead of a diesel-powered relic." A profound, shamed silence descended upon the engine room. The crew stared, their mouths agape, looking from the furious admiral to the quiet, unassuming old man. In their eyes, Richard Morrow transformed from a senile nuisance into a figure of legend. Corporal Evans looked as if he wanted the deck to open up and swallow him whole. His arrogance had not just been misplaced, it had been sacrilege. Admiral Thompson fixed his icy glare on Commander Shaw. "Commander, your performance today has been a disgrace to your rank. You failed to control your subordinate, and you failed to recognize genius when it was standing right in front of you, offering to save your ship. Your command is under review, effective immediately." He then turned to the pale, trembling Corporal Evans. "Corporal, your conduct was beneath the uniform of a United States Marine. You will be formally reprimanded for gross disrespect to a civilian guest and a national hero, a man who has forgotten more about naval engineering than you will ever learn." "Sir, I didn't know," Evans stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Before the Admiral could deliver another verbal blow, Richard Morrow spoke up. His voice, calm and even, cut through the tension. "He's just a kid, Jimmy, full of pride and vinegar. We were all like that once." He turned to face Corporal Evans, and there was no anger in his eyes, no hint of triumph, only a gentle, weary understanding. "Son, respect isn't about age or rank. It's about what you do when the lights go out and the alarms are screaming. It's about listening to the quiet voice of experience when all the loud ones are panicking. Remember that." Morrow then turned his back on them all, his attention returning to the console as if the entire confrontation had been a minor interruption. "Now, if you'll all excuse me," he said, his focus absolute. "I believe I was just about to restart the primary coolant loop." His graceful, quiet lesson, delivered without a trace of malice, was more punishing than any of the Admiral's rage. It left the young men standing in a state of profound and lasting shame. Morrow reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small, worn object made of brass. It was a simple T-shaped valve key, its edges polished smooth by decades of anxious handling. As his fingers closed around it, the world flickered again. The flash of memory was not of terror this time, but of triumph. A much younger Morrow, his face grimy but his eyes bright, stood before the captain of the USS Enterprise. The crisis was over. The ship was saved. The captain took the key, still hot to the touch, from the reactor console and pressed it into Morrow's hand. "The heart of this ship is yours now, son," the captain had said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've earned it." The key was not a medal to be displayed, but a tool, a sacred symbol of responsibility and hands-on knowledge bestowed in a moment of ultimate trust. Back in the present, Morrow found a small, unmarked keyhole on the dormant console, a relic of analog design nearly invisible amongst the dead touchscreens. The brass key slid in. It was a perfect fit. With a lifetime of experience behind the simple motion, he gave it a quarter turn. With the turn of that small brass key, the soul of the USS Gerald R. Ford roared to life. It was not a gradual awakening, but a sudden, violent resurrection. The main lights blazed on, flooding the engine room with brilliant white light. The massive turbines, silent for so long, began to spin with a deafening, magnificent crescendo of power. Every console, every screen, every light on every panel flashed green. A triumphant, unified cheer erupted from the assembled crew, a spontaneous explosion of relief and awe. Weeks later, under a clear blue sky, A formal ceremony was held on the flight deck of the carrier. In response to the incident, the Navy had instituted a new fleet-wide training mandate, the Morrow Procedure, a required course focusing on the history and manual operation of naval nuclear reactors, ensuring the lessons of the past would never again be forgotten. In front of the entire crew, Admiral Thompson pinned the Navy Distinguished Service Medal, the highest non-combat decoration, to Richard Morrow's chest. The epilogue played out not on a flight deck but in a small-town diner months later. Corporal Evans, stripped of his swagger and humbled by his reprimand, sat nursing a cup of coffee. He looked up as the bell above the door chimed and saw Richard Morrow shuffle in. The old man sat at the counter alone, slowly stirring a cup of tea. Evans watched him for a long moment. He took a deep breath, stood up and walked over. He stood there awkward and silent, until Morrow looked up. "Mr. Morrow, sir," Evans began, his voice quiet. "I just wanted to, well, the coffee's on me." Richard Morrow looked at the young Marine, and the same calm, gentle smile he wore in the engine room touched his lips. "Thank you, Corporal. Sit down. Tell me about yourself." In the quiet clatter of the diner, the young chastened Marine and the unassuming hero began to talk, forging a new bond built not on rank or reputation but on a simple, hard-won lesson in respect. If you were moved by Richard Morrow's story of quiet courage, please like this video and share it with someone who respects our veterans. Subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories of the heroes who walk among us.